In the bitter autumn of 1880, deep in what would soon become South Dakota Territory, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Anderson was building something his neighbors called a mistake. The settlement near the Cheyenne River consisted of about 24 homesteads scattered across the grassland, each family a hard day's ride from the next closest cabin. Lars had arrived that spring with his wife Ingrid and their 2 young daughters, staking a claim on a windswept stretch of prairie where timber was scarce, and winter came early and stayed late, while every other family was frantically chinking logs and stockpiling firewood for the freeze ahead. Lars was doing something that made no sense to anyone watching. He was digging into the earth itself, carving out a dwelling that sat half buried in the hillside, then packing soil against its walls like he was trying to bury his own home before winter could do it for him. The other settlers thought he'd lost his mind. Some said it outright. Lars had come from a coastal region of Norway, where winters were long but moderated by the sea, and he'd worked as a ship's carpenter before the promise of free land brought his family across the Atlantic. He wasn't a farmer, wasn't a plainsman, but he was a man who paid attention to how things worked. When he'd first arrived in Dakota Territory that spring, he'd noticed something the others seemed to overlook. Root cellars stayed cool all summer. The trading post's underground storage never froze solid even in January. Prairie dog burrows remained temperate, while the surface baked or froze. The earth itself, he realized, held a steady temperature that resisted the extremes of sun and cold alike. While his neighbors were building the same type of log cabins they'd known back east, structures that required constant feeding with firewood and still left families shivering through the night, Lars saw an opportunity to work with the land instead of just on top of it. The problem was universal out here. Timber was precious on the treeless prairie. A single cabin might require more logs than a man could cut and haul in a season. Then you'd burn through cord after cord of wood just trying to stay warm. Wood you'd have to haul from the river bottoms miles away. Even then, those thin log walls leaked heat like a sieve, and families woke to ice on the inside of their windows. When Lars tried to explain his thinking to his nearest neighbor, a Missouri farmer named John Whitmore, who lived about 3 miles south, the man just shook his head. "You're gonna freeze your family to death in a hole in the ground," Whitmore said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "Might as well dig your graves now and save time." Another settler, Thomas McKinley, whose homestead sat closer to the river, was even more blunt. "Man doesn't live in the earth like an animal," he said. "That's what the Indians used to do, and look where it got them." But Lars had made his decision. The ridicule stung, especially when Ingrid herself wondered aloud if they'd made a terrible mistake coming to this place. But he'd observed something true, and he trusted what he'd seen. The earth was stable. The earth was insulation. If he built correctly, the earth could be shelter. The social cost of his decision grew heavier as autumn progressed. While other families gathered for barn raisings and shared labor on traditional cabins, Lars worked alone. His daughters asked why the other children laughed when they described their home. Ingrid grew quieter, and Lars could see the doubt in her eyes every morning. The Whitmores invited them to church gatherings less frequently. When Lars rode to the trading post for supplies, men would nod but not engage. He became the eccentric Norwegian with the strange ideas, the man too proud or too foolish to build a proper home. Some of the women whispered that Ingrid deserved better, that Lars's stubbornness was putting his family at risk. The pressure mounted with each passing week as the cottonwood leaves turned yellow and the evening air carried the promise of frost. Lars himself lay awake some nights, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, wondering if everyone else was right and he was catastrophically wrong. But every time he visited his root cellar or felt the stable temperature of the earth itself, his conviction returned. He would see this through. The location Lars had chosen was a south-facing hillside with good drainage, a natural rise in the prairie that would allow him to dig back into the slope rather than straight down. By late September, he'd spent nearly 2 months excavating into the hillside, creating a chamber that extended back about the length of 3 wagons into the earth. The work was back-breaking. Every shovelful of soil hauled out in a wheelbarrow he'd built himself. He dug down far enough that a tall man could stand upright comfortably, creating a space that would house his entire family. The walls he cut weren't vertical, but slightly sloped inward, more stable that way, less likely to collapse. The floor he packed hard and level, mixing in clay from the riverbed to create a surface that would resist moisture. As he worked, he remembered the ship's hull construction he'd learned in Norway, how the strongest structures distributed stress across curves rather than angles. He applied those same principles here, underground on the Dakota prairie, though he never spoke of it in those terms. For the front wall, the only part that would fully face the elements, Lars hauled cottonwood logs from the river bottom. A 3-hour journey each way with his ox team. He needed about 4 dozen logs, each one stripped of bark and allowed to dry as much as time permitted. These he set vertically into a trench he'd dug, packing them tightly together and filling the gaps with a mixture of clay and prairie grass. The logs stood about as tall as a man and a half, forming a solid face with a single door and 2 small windows fitted with oiled paper that let in light but kept out wind. Above this, he built a roof using smaller timbers and branches laid crosswise, covered with layers of prairie sod cut in thick squares. The sod was heavy, dense with root systems that held it together like nature's own shingles. He laid these grass side up so the roots would continue growing, creating a living roof that would only get stronger with time. But the innovation that seemed most absurd to his neighbours was what came next. Once the structure was complete, Lars began the process of banking earth against the walls. Not just a little decorative mounding, but a massive undertaking that involved hauling wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of soil and packing it against the sides and over the top of his dwelling. He built the earth up gradually, creating a slope that rose from ground level to cover everything except the front wall and extended back to blend into the hillside itself. By the time he finished, you could stand 20 paces away and barely see the structure, just the log front wall and the grass-covered roof that looked like a natural part of the hill. The dwelling had disappeared into the landscape. He'd spent nearly 4 months on the project, working through summer heat and autumn cold, every day aware of his neighbour's judgment and his family's uncertainty. John Whitmore rode by one afternoon in early October and just sat on his horse, staring. "You've buried your own house," he said finally. "Covered it like you're ashamed of it." Lars wiped the sweat from his face and tried to explain. "The earth holds steady," he said in his accented English. "In summer, cool. In winter, warm. Not fighting the temperature, working with it." Whitmore spat. "You'll suffocate in there, or drown when the snow melts. Mark my words, come spring, you'll be building a proper cabin like everyone else, if you survive that long." Thomas McKinley brought his sons by, and Lars heard them laughing as they rode away, the boys making jokes about living with the gophers. Even the circuit preacher, when he passed through that month, looked at the earth-banked structure and shook his head sadly, though he said nothing. The settlement had made its judgment. Lars Anderson had wasted precious time and labour on a fool's notion that would fail its first real test. The first cold snaps came in late October, and the real work of winter preparation consumed every family's attention. The Whitmores spent long days splitting firewood, building up a pile behind their cabin that stood taller than a man. McKinley and his boys hauled load after load of logs from the river, stockpiling fuel they hoped would last until spring. Everyone knew the stories. Families that underestimated Dakota winter and ran out of fuel before March. Children who froze to death in cabins where the fire went out. The cold here was different from back east, drier and sharper, with winds that found every crack and gap in a structure. A well-built log cabin might keep you alive, but comfortable was another matter entirely. Inside those traditional structures, families huddled near the fireplace or stove, and you could see your breath in the corners farthest from the heat source. Ice formed on the inside of walls. Water buckets froze overnight, even indoors. Staying warm meant constant work, feeding the fire every few hours, day and night. Lars moved his family into their new home in early November, just as the first serious snow began to fall. The initial adjustment was strange for everyone. The ceiling was lower than in a traditional cabin, just high enough for Lars to stand without ducking, and the thick walls made the space feel enclosed in a way that took getting used to. But within the first week, they noticed something remarkable. The small iron stove Lars had installed, fed with just a few sticks of wood, kept the entire space comfortable, not just bearable, but genuinely warm. Ingrid, who'd been skeptical throughout the building process, commented that she didn't feel the drafts that had plagued their previous homes. The girls slept soundly without piling on every blanket they owned. When Lars woke to feed the stove during the night, he noticed he could go longer between feedings than he'd ever been able to before. The heat wasn't escaping. It was staying where they needed it. The first real test came in late November, when temperatures plunged and stayed down for nearly a week. John Whitmore later told folks at the trading post that he'd burned through more than half a cord of wood in those 7 days, and his family still shivered through the nights. His water bucket froze solid by morning. His wife and children wore all their clothes to bed, layered under every quilt they owned. About 3 miles north, the Andersons' small stove burned steadily but modestly. Lars estimated he was using less than a third of the wood his neighbours were consuming, maybe even less than a quarter. Inside the earth-banked lodge, the temperature stayed steady enough that Ingrid could do her mending in comfort, and the girls played on the packed earth floor without needing to huddle by the stove. The difference was striking enough that Lars began to understand fully what he'd created. The principle behind it was simpler than it looked, though Lars would never have described it in scientific terms. He understood it the way a practical man understands anything that works, through observation and comparison. The earth itself, once you got a few feet down, stayed at a temperature that was cool in summer and relatively warm in winter, maybe somewhere around the temperature of a spring day, though it was hard to say exactly. It wasn't hot, and it wasn't cold. It was stable. By building his home half-buried and then banking even more earth against it, Lars had surrounded his living space with thousands upon thousands of pounds of soil that acted like a massive buffer against temperature swings. The heat from his small stove had to warm that mass of earth, true. But once warmed, the earth held that heat and released it slowly back into the living space. It worked the same way a stone fireplace stays warm long after the fire dies, or the way A root cellar stays cool because the earth around it resists heating up. The thick earth banks meant the bitter cold outside never reached the walls of his home directly. The wind, which could strip heat from a log cabin faster than you could feed a fire, hit only the front wall, and even that was partially sheltered by the overhang of earth above. The sod roof worked in concert with the banked walls, creating a barrier that was far thicker than any wooden roof and shingles. Snow that fell on it actually helped, adding another layer of insulation. Inside, the air stayed comfortable because the heat wasn't racing out through thin walls and roof like it did in conventional structures. It was like wearing a thick coat versus just a shirt. The coat trapped your body heat close to you instead of letting it escape into the cold air. Lars's earth-banked lodge trapped the stove's heat close to the living space instead of letting it escape into the frigid Dakota winter. His neighbors' cabins were like trying to stay warm in just a shirt, constantly fighting a losing battle against the cold. Every hour, every day, burning through precious firewood just to maintain a barely tolerable temperature. Lars wasn't fighting that battle. He'd built something that worked with nature's own patterns instead of against them. The explanation satisfied Lars's own curiosity about why his gamble had paid off. But it didn't change his neighbors' opinions. Not yet. They attributed his family's comfort to luck, or to Norwegian blood being used to cold, or to Lars exaggerating how well his buried house actually worked. Winter had just begun, they said. Wait until January. Wait until February. Wait until a real cold snap hit. Then they'd see the truth. The skepticism held firm through early December, as families across the settlement burned through their wood piles and made arduous trips to the river bottoms for more fuel. Lars made those same trips, but far less frequently. He passed John Whitmore on the trail one afternoon, both men hauling logs with their ox teams. Whitmore's load was the third that week. Lars's was his first in nearly 2 weeks. Neither man said anything, but the contrast was obvious. The winter of 1880-1881 was building towards something the old-timers would later call the worst cold snap in memory, though nobody knew it yet. Through late December, temperatures dropped steadily, and the wind blew with a persistence that wore down even the hardiest settlers. The Whitmore's cabin developed cracks between the logs despite careful chinking, and John spent hours trying to fill them with whatever material he could find, mud and rags and bits of sod, anything to stop the drafts. The McKinley family's youngest child developed a cough that wouldn't go away, the kind of cough that came from sleeping in a cold room, night after night. At the trading post on Christmas Eve, the men gathered around the stove and talked about fuel supplies with barely concealed worry. Several families had already burned through more wood than they'd planned. If the winter held hard into March, some folks might be in real trouble. Lars and Ingrid attended the Christmas gathering at the settlement's small schoolhouse, bringing the girls to see other children and share what little celebration the community could manage. The other women were kind to Ingrid, but there was a distance there, a careful politeness that hurt more than outright rudeness would have. One of McKinley's older daughters asked the Anderson girls if it was scary living underground. Another child asked if they had to dig their way out when it snowed. Lars saw his daughters' faces and felt the sting of his family's social isolation. He'd been right about his building technique, he was sure of that now. But being right didn't make his family welcome. That night, riding back to their earth-banked lodge through the dark and cold, Lars wondered if the price of being different was always this high. Ingrid held the girls close under the wagon blankets and said nothing, but he could feel her thinking the same thoughts. The new year arrived with clear skies and temperatures that plunged deeper than any cold they'd seen so far. By the second week of January, the prairie had become a frozen wasteland where exposed skin could freeze in minutes, and breathing the outside air felt like inhaling knives. Old-timers at the trading post said it reminded them of the terrible winter of '73, though this might be worse. The wind never stopped, howling across the open land with nothing to slow it down, piling snow into drifts taller than a man on horseback, and stripping away any heat that tried to exist above ground. Game disappeared, driven into whatever shelter they could find, or frozen where they stood. Cattle huddled in whatever lee they could locate, many of them dying where they stood, frozen solid. This was Dakota Territory, showing what it could do to those who underestimated it. Inside the earth-banked lodge, Lars kept the small stove burning steadily, but without the desperate urgency his neighbors were experiencing. The thick earth surrounding his family absorbed the modest heat and held it close, releasing it slowly into the living space hour after hour. The temperature inside stayed comfortable enough that Ingrid could work without wearing her heavy coat, something she'd never been able to do in previous winters. The girls could sit on the floor playing with their carved wooden dolls without shivering. At night, the family slept soundly without the fear of the fire dying and waking to dangerous cold. Lars still rose twice each night to add fuel, but he was adding small sticks and split pieces, not the large logs his neighbors were feeding to their hungry stoves and fireplaces around the clock. His woodpile, which had looked dangerously small compared to others in the settlement, was holding up far better than anyone had predicted. He was on track to make it through the winter with fuel to spare. Meanwhile, 3 miles south, the Whitmore family was in trouble. John had burned through more than 3/4 of his woodpile by mid-January, and the cold showed no signs of breaking. His wife Mary was rationing fuel now, letting the fire die down at night, and trying to keep everyone alive under piles of blankets, waking to a cabin so cold that water in the bucket was frozen solid, and frost coated the inside walls thick as a thumb. The children were constantly cold, huddling together for warmth, their fingers and toes aching from the chill that never really left, even when the fire was going strong. John made the 3-hour journey to the river bottoms again, but the cold made it dangerous work. His ox team struggled through snow and bitter wind, and John himself could feel the freeze working its way through his layers of clothes. He hauled back what he could, but it was like trying to fill a leaking bucket. The wood went into the fire, and the heat escaped through the walls, and he knew, with growing dread, that he might not have enough to see his family through to spring. The breaking point came on January 18th, a day when the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground, and the wind cut through every layer like it wasn't there at all. John Whitmore's woodpile was down to less than a week's supply, and he'd burned the last of it during the night, trying to keep his children from freezing. That morning, desperate and terrified, he hitched up his ox team and made the frigid ride to the Anderson place. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. His family's survival mattered more than his opinions about living in the ground. When Lars opened the door to John's knock, the contrast hit Whitmore like a physical blow. Warm air flowed out from the earth-banked lodge, air that felt almost cozy after the knife-edge cold outside. John stood there on the threshold, looking into the dimly lit interior where Ingrid was working at a table and the girls were playing on the floor, none of them bundled against the cold, and he felt something crack inside his chest. "I was wrong," John said simply, his voice rough with cold and emotion. "About your house. About what you built." Lars said nothing, just gestured for the man to come inside and warm himself by the stove. John stepped into the lodge and felt the warmth envelop him. Not the fierce heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, steady warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself felt alive with comfort. He looked at the small stove with its modest fire, looked at the woodpile that was still substantial while his own was nearly gone, and understood completely what Lars had accomplished. This wasn't luck. This wasn't Norwegian blood. This was brilliant, practical engineering born from careful observation. And John Whitmore had mocked it because it looked strange. He'd nearly cost his own family their lives because he couldn't see past tradition to recognize innovation. Lars offered John coffee, and they sat at the table, two men who'd been neighbors but not friends. And John spoke from his heart. "I need to know how you did this," he said. "My family won't make it through winter in our cabin. I need to build something that works." Lars explained in his careful English, using comparisons John could understand. The earth was like wearing a thick coat. The banked walls were like surrounding your house with thousands of pounds of rock that held steady at a comfortable temperature. The sod roof kept heat from escaping upward. The small windows and single door reduced openings where warmth could flee. Everything worked together. The same way a ship's hull worked together to stay afloat, though Lars didn't use those words. He talked about what he'd observed, what he'd learned, what had proven true over these brutal months. John listened with the intensity of a man whose family's survival depended on understanding. When Lars offered to help him build an earth-banked addition to his existing cabin, something that could be done even in winter, if they worked carefully, John accepted with gratitude that showed in his weathered face. The two men shook hands, and something shifted in the frozen Dakota landscape. Innovation had proven itself through the harshest test imaginable. Word spread through the settlement faster than John Whitmore would have preferred. Within days, other families knew that he'd gone to the Norwegian's earth-buried house and found it warm while his own cabin was failing. Some folks understood immediately. Others took longer to set aside their pride. But by early February, as the brutal cold continued and woodpiles shrank and children shivered through the nights, the judgment shifted. Lars Anderson wasn't crazy. He'd seen something true and built something that worked. The ridicule that had defined his autumn became quiet respect through the winter. Men started riding by his place, ostensibly to check on their neighbor, but really to see the lodge with fresh eyes. Women asked Ingrid at church how she managed with so little firewood. The circuit preacher, when he passed through in late February, made a point of visiting the Anderson home and remarking thoughtfully on the wisdom of learning from the land itself. Thomas McKinley was the second to ask for Lars's help, his pride finally breaking in the face of his son's persistent cough and his wife's exhaustion from trying to keep their cabin warm. Then came the Hanson family, then the Johnsons, then others. Spring was still weeks away, but already men were planning. When the ground thawed and building season returned, they would construct earth-banked lodges for their families, not to replace their cabins entirely, perhaps, but as winter quarters that would spare them the desperate fuel consumption and constant cold that defined Dakota winters in traditional structures. Lars drew rough plans in the dirt, explaining the key principles again and again. Dig into a hillside if you have one. Bank earth thick against all walls. Build your roof heavy with sod. Keep your openings minimal, but sufficient for light and air. Work with the land's own temperature instead of fighting it. The winter of 1880–1881 finally broke in late March, and the settlement had survived, though several families credited Lars's willingness to share his innovation with saving them when their fuel ran critically low. That spring and summer, 5 new earth-banked lodges rose in the settlement, each family adapting Lars's core principles to their own needs and situations. Some built completely underground, like his. Others created hybrid structures with traditional log cabins fronted by earth-banked additions. The trading post owner, a shrewd businessman, noted that lumber sales dropped while tool sales for earth-moving increased. Travellers passing through the area remarked on the strange sight of homes that seemed to grow from the hillsides themselves. Grass-covered roofs that you could walk across without knowing there was a dwelling beneath your feet. John Whitmore's earth-banked addition, completed by midsummer, saved his family the following winter. He burned less than a third of the wood he'd used the previous year, and never again faced the terror of running out of fuel. His children slept warm, and his wife stopped waking with the haunted look that came from constant worry. Thomas McKinley built a full earth-banked lodge that became his family's primary dwelling, his old cabin repurposed as storage. The settlement transformed over the next several years, as more families adopted the technique, learning and refining it, adding their own observations and improvements. By the mid-1880s, earth-banked lodges were common enough in that part of Dakota Territory that newcomers learned the technique from established settlers, and the innovation that had seemed so absurd in 1880 had become accepted wisdom. The Anderson family's original lodge served them faithfully for more than 15 years. Lars eventually built a larger traditional farmhouse when prosperity allowed, but they kept the earth-banked structure and used it for storage and as guest quarters, and, in the depths of hard winters, as a warm refuge that required almost no fuel to heat. When Lars and Ingrid's daughters married and started their own homesteads, both incorporated earth-banking into their homes, passing along their father's observation-born wisdom to a new generation. The lodge itself stood until the early 1900s, when age and weather finally undermined its structure. But by then, it had served 3 families and proven its principles countless times over. The story of Lars Anderson and his earth-banked lodge echoes down through Dakota homesteading history as a lesson about innovation, persistence, and the wisdom of observation over tradition. What looked foolish to his neighbours in the autumn of 1880 proved brilliantly practical by the winter of 1881. What seemed like burying a house turned out to be surrounding it with the most effective insulation the prairie could provide. The ridicule Lars endured transformed into respect, and his willingness to share his technique, despite that initial mockery, helped other families survive the brutal Dakota winters. His innovation wasn't born from formal education or engineering principles, but from paying attention to how the natural world actually worked, and having the courage to build something different, even when everyone around him said he was making a terrible mistake. There's something deeply human in that pattern, something that repeats across history and places and cultures. Innovation often looks like foolishness until it proves itself. The person who thinks differently, who observes what others overlook, who builds something unconventional based on what they've noticed rather than what tradition dictates, that person faces ridicule until the moment they face validation. Lars Anderson could have given up when his neighbours mocked him, could have built a traditional cabin to avoid the social cost of being different, but he trusted what he'd observed about the Earth's steady temperature, and he built accordingly. The brutal winter of 1880–1881 proved him right in terms that nobody could argue with. comfort versus suffering, modest fuel consumption versus desperate shortage, families sleeping warm versus children shivering through the night. The evidence was experiential and undeniable. What resonates across the years is not just the technique itself, though earth banking and underground construction remain valid approaches to energy-efficient shelter even today. What resonates is the human story behind it. An immigrant carpenter who paid attention to root cellars and prairie dog burrows. A father who endured his family's uncertainty and his community's judgment because he believed in what he'd observed. Neighbors who eventually set aside pride to ask for help. A community that transformed ridicule into respect when innovation proved itself through the harshest possible test. These were real people making real decisions with their family's survival at stake. And the wisdom that emerged from that crucible deserves to be remembered and honored. The frontier tested everyone who went there, but it also created space for those willing to think differently, to observe carefully, to build based on what worked rather than what was expected. Lars Anderson represents countless other pioneers whose names we don't know, who solved impossible problems with what they had and what they noticed, whose innovations helped their communities survive and sometimes thrive in conditions that would have defeated those who rigidly held to tradition. Their stories are worth preserving, worth sharing, worth learning from. They remind us that wisdom doesn't only come from formal knowledge, but also from observation, from persistence, from the courage to build something different, even when others say it cannot work. If these stories of frontier innovation and survival speak to you, if you find value in preserving the memory of people like Lars Anderson, who solved problems through careful observation and practical ingenuity, then I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and join a community that honors these histories. Each like helps ensure these narratives reach others who appreciate the resourcefulness and determination that defined the frontier experience. And I'd love to hear in the comments about any similar stories from your own family history. Innovations your ancestors developed, techniques that seemed strange but proved invaluable. These stories connect us to a heritage of practical problem-solving that transcends any single time or place. They remind us what human beings can accomplish when they observe carefully, think creatively, and persist despite doubt. Out on that Dakota hillside, where Lars Anderson once carved his home into the earth itself, the land has long since reclaimed what he built. But the principle he proved endures, and the story of his persistence in the face of ridicule continues to teach us something valuable. Sometimes the wisest course is the one that looks foolish until it's tested. Sometimes survival requires building differently, thinking independently, and trusting careful observation over inherited tradition. That lesson, learned in the brutal winter of 1880-1881, remains as true today as it was then.